They win. There yet? We must be there.
I said yes.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Astro Imaging channel. We got lots of people in the room tonight, and probably because we have a great presentation from Bray Falls that's built Starfront, got it right? Starfront Observatory, which I understand has become very popular, and he's going to tell us all about the process. Like everything else, you know, I'm sure it wasn't straightforward all the way, and there's lots of little issues that you run across in building an observatory, but I understand it's up and running and lots of very happy customers. And I guess that says that there's a lot, I'll say more interest. There must be more and more interest in people doing remote imaging, since our skies are getting brighter and brighter, and remote imaging is a way to get around that and get back to those dark skies. But before we get to Bray, we have a couple people that are going to give us a little introduction. Jim Thompson is going to present next week. So Jim, you want to give us a little preview?
Sure. Thanks, Eric. So next week, I'm going to talk about all of the accessories that are available today to enhance your solar observing / imaging, right from white light filters all the way up to fancy hydrogen alpha scopes. And I will show you visually what the difference is between each of those accessories. And if I'm able to get my processing done, I will have some spectroheliograph images to share as well. So that's all next week.
What's a spectroheliograph?
A spectroheliograph is a device that allows you to spread out the spectrum of the sun, pick a wavelength, and create an image in that specific wavelength. And I will talk more about that next week.
That sounds like fun. And Marcia Wilcox wants to do a little recruiting. So we'd say we'd give her 30 seconds. Okay, clock's ticking, Marcia.
Terrific. I'm putting together a show or coordinating a show about collaborative imaging. You look out on Astroband, some of the most incredible images are done by small groups of astro imagers. So I'm looking for folks to work with us on that show to talk about the collaborative imaging you've made, what you've learned, and what would help others get started in the process. Some of the people in the room tonight have done absolutely extraordinary collaborative images. So thank you very much. To join us, go to the astroimagingchannel.org, go to the contact page, and let us know that you're interested. We'd love to have you join us. Thanks.
And I think more and more, we're all doing some forms of collaborative images. I would say 10 years ago, that probably wasn't the case, but now it's real easy to share large amounts of data. And you can just get a better image in the long run when you share your data and share your expertise. I see Molly has her cat. Molly and her cat is running the show tonight. Hello, kitty. All right, we got Jim next week. Molly, get that cat out of there. Jim is going to present next week, and after that, we have a break for Neve. Paul Sniglet is going to present after that. I won't go to the calendar, but in subsequent weeks, we have some open slots. So we always want people who have something interesting to say or have something to say about astrophotography to volunteer. Go to the astroimagingchannel.org, go to the contact page, just send us a note, give us an idea of what you want to do, and someone will get back to you, and the odds are you will be on the show sometime in the future. And I think that's about it, unless I've missed something. So Bray, are you ready to present?
Yes, I can take us away here.
All right. Let's all shut off our cameras and mute our microphones.
Is my screen functional as it should be? Just give me a thumbs up if it is.
We don't see you sharing yet.
Yeah.
Let me hit the button.
You got to hit the button.
Yeah, and you leave your camera on, Bray.
I hit the wrong button.
No worries. That's the square with the arrow.
Yes, here we go.
Very
You're
good.
good.
Looks
you got
good.
it.
Excellent. Cool. First, I just want to say thank you guys for having me on. I feel like I've been watching the Astro Imaging channel for so many years at this point, and it's cool to finally be here. But this talk is going to be about building and using a remote observatory. So I'll kind of explain the story of how we started our remote observatory, and then I'll give you all some practical lessons that we've learned from installing and supporting over 330 telescopes at this point. So just a brief introduction for those of you who don't know me. My name's Bray. I grew up in Cave Creek, Arizona, which I always like to say is a really great place to be born if you want to do astrophotography. I got started in astronomy very young at the age of 13, and I'm 27 years old now. I got my bachelor's of engineering for aerospace engineering at ASU. I worked as an engineer for about a year, and then I left my job to do astrophotography full time about 3 years ago now. And currently I work and live full time out at the Starfront Observatories here in Central Texas. So our idea for the observatory, remote observatories aren't really a novel concept. There's a lot of them that exist and have existed for a while. It is really just a building where the roof opens up at night, where you can host your telescope and hopefully get some more efficiency out of doing your astrophotography. The thing that we thought of that was a little bit different was to try to open it up to the broader audience of astrophotographers by trying to make it a lot more affordable and accessible. There's a lot of remote observatories, but they tend to cater towards, this upper end of the market where you may have more of a research style system, maybe a big plane wave, but we wanted to open it up to the hobbyists like an AM5 and a small refractor. So that was our goal from the start. And when you consider this, small telescopes can be packed in closely into a building. And so you can fit lots of them together. And with that kind of played a lot into our site selection for the observatory. We have a bit more of an infrastructure requirement as compared to other remote observatories, just because we need so much internet and infrastructure for our buildings. So we searched for a lot of different sites for quite a long time. And where we ended up settling on is basically right in the geographic center of Texas. You can see here on my location pin. We're about 2.5 hours from both Austin, Dallas, and San Antonio, right in the middle of Texas. The skies out here are quite dark, and they offered also kind of the best balance between the infrastructure we needed, the darkness, and of course the number of clear nights per year that we got. So we broke ground out here in May of 2024. For the first month or so, we lived out here in RVs with no water, no internet. We were really just camping and building. In some ways, we are still camping out here full time. I've been out here for about 9 months. It's been a very interesting experience, but these first two buildings, the very first ones, we planned to have about 100 telescopes in those. The buildings were about 40 by 30 feet with the classic roll-off roof design. Nothing fancy there with the buildings, but what did kind of become fancy for us was figuring out how to put all these telescopes into a building in a way that's letting us be very efficient. So our idea to kind of make this all more affordable for the average astrophotographer is by getting really ruthless about the space that we occupied on the floor and getting as much density as physically possible without anyone's telescopes hitting each other. And so this kind of gave us a big geometry problem. And what we ended up doing was coming up with this term, the swing diameter, which you can think of it as like the horizontally projected space that your telescope occupies on the floor. If you were to take your scope and slew it around and try to get it to reach out as far as possible, that would be your swing diameter. And after a lot of time of slewing around telescopes, we ended up sitting down thinking about it, and we found a way to measure this in quite a simple way, where we didn't even need to set up the telescope to know what this metric was. So here in this diagram, you can kind of see our definition for the swing radius or the swing diameter. For an equatorial mount, it's really just this distance from the RA pivot point all the way to the most distant spot from the RA pivot point. And you can measure this directly with a tape measure, either just by going on the side of a mount all the way up to the top. And that'll give you a super easy way to know at the park position how big your scope can be horizontally. Or we can even measure this without the scope set up. With it on the floor, we can find the balance point and then know kind of the mount's moment arm, and then determine this metric. But over time, as we collected more and more telescopes, we kind of began to develop sizing tiers to usefully classify things in a way to where we could make pre-prescribed floor plans for the observatory, so that we could be planning for the future and being efficient and not trying to go, one telescope at a time and figuring out how things were in a messy way. So we ended up making about 5 different tiers. We have smart telescopes, minis, light standards, and heavies, and those just gradually increase in the diameter that they occupy. So currently, we have about 330 telescopes on site. I think it's 332 as of tonight that are operational. We're up to 8 buildings, and we're currently in the process of constructing 3 more. There on the bottom image, you can see the foundations. They're actually going to pour concrete for those tomorrow morning at 5 a.m. So I'm going to be awake for that bright and early to witness the concrete pouring for the next buildings. And yeah, that's kind of our, you can see our whole site actually from these drone photos as well. It backs up all the way there to the tree line in the south. Our roofs roll in the south direction. So a fair amount of space there for more buildings and such. So with over 300 different telescope setups on site, we've pretty much seen, used, and set up every single telescope component that really exists. There's only a very few amount of things we haven't seen yet here on site. I don't think we have any plane wave L mounts yet. That should change shortly. But yeah, we've learned a lot supporting and installing all these telescopes as far as what works for remote observing and what is less effective for remote. And so now I'm going to kind of go through all the lessons we've learned about what kind of makes someone successful at remote imaging and what you can do or plan for your setup. So in building a remote setup, they all kind of have the same components. They just kind of take different shapes and sizes depending on what you choose. Every setup has a mount, a camera, a filter reel, an autoguider, autofocuser, a computer, etc. The only difference between the setup you might consider for use in a backyard versus in a remote context is your ability to do everything automated. So you should be able to go to sleep and your telescope will do its business, and you'll wake up in the morning to a whole bunch of data on your hard drive. The other big differentiating factor is your ability to do remote power cycling to allow you to troubleshoot or do other things with your setup. And people will typically do this with something like a TP-Link or CASA power switch or a digital logger. But that's really the only thing that differentiates a backyard setup from a remote setup. And I always like to say a lot of people are actually already doing remote imaging. If you're in your bedroom while your telescope is in the backyard at night, this is technically speaking remote. It's just a little bit closer than, if you sent it hundreds of miles away. So one of the most important pieces for a DSO rig for remote is what kind of computer you use. And we have a whole variety of different control schemes on site. One of the most interesting that I've learned about was actually that the ASI Air is a functional method for remote control. I had no idea about this until a customer actually brought one on site. He dropped it off, and I was confused. I was like, how are you going to run your remote telescope with just an ASI Air? He's like, oh, I'll just use a router and a VPN. And it turns out that's a totally usable way to run a whole remote telescope, is just using the ASI Air. And it's quite a stable way to do it because they kind of run off of more of a Linux system. They're not really prone to updates or crashes or things like that. So it's quite a robust system. And some people here even choose to use this in tandem with a mini PC. So they have two different control methods for some redundancy, or maybe they're not familiar with ENA or other control schemes. And so they have both options as needed. The main quirk with running an ASI Air for remote is that every time you use it, you actually have to type in the coordinates and the time zone. Because of the way it works with the VPN, the app on your phone is going to believe you're using the scope where you are with your phone, and you kind of have to force it to believe the truth, which is that you're not actually right next to your telescope. So yeah, that's how ASIers work on site. And you can see here a couple ASIers on different setups. We have maybe 70 plus ASIers on site, and they rarely give us any issues. So if you're a travel shooter and you're considering remote, it's definitely a viable option and an easy way to get into it. So we've also got a lot of the Prima Luce Eagle computers on site. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with these. They're kind of an all-in-one package for power supply, USB, and all these things. And they often come with like these nice mounting brackets, so you can super cleanly mount everything to a telescope. Of the things we've had that have failed on site for computers, Prima Luce Eagles have failed the most. If you have a good one, chances are it's good. But if you have a lemon, they do kind of show themselves very quickly. But here are just some of the ones we have on site. I actually use Eagles for a couple of my own setups, and they worked well for me. But yeah, they make for quite nice cable management. So it's definitely an option. By far, the most popular control method here at the observatory are nukes or mini PCs. We have tons of them. The two most popular models by far are going to be the B-Link SIR mini PCs or the Melee quieters. A lot of people opt for the Melee quieter because it's fanless, and so you can mount it to your scope without really having to worry so much about vibration. However, we've seen plenty of people mounting B-Links to their scopes without noticing any vibration issue, as you can see with these other systems. The only thing to consider when you're looking at nukes is, again, if you have like an active or passive cooling system on the fans. And I specifically highlighted this Melee quieter PC here with a heatsink that's thermally taped onto the Melee. If you do have a Melee PC in a remote observatory, I would highly suggest this because these things run super, super hot, especially in the summertime. I would even suggest powering these things down in the daytime if you're not using them, because they really do cook. The B-Links, not so much, but both have been quite well. We haven't had any B-Links or Melee quieters break yet on site, and there are a couple hundred of them here. So those are the computers. A really important thing, of course, when you're doing astrophotography is picking the telescope. And for remote imaging, the great thing about telescopes is that basically every telescope works well. You could use a camera lens, you could use a giant plane wave. As long as what you have is mechanically stable at home in your backyard and you're happy with it, it's not going to be made any worse by using it in a remote context. And there is also kind of a common misconception that remote may only be worth it if you're using, a giant plane wave telescope. But I would say it's definitely not the case, especially for wide field. There's a lot of really interesting targets that you simply can't really shoot from light pollution, or they're very difficult to shoot while traveling. So really any telescope I would say is fair game, but there are definitely some considerations to think about for each type of telescope. So here I've just shown a bunch of the different refractors that we have at the observatory. Refractors are by far the most popular telescope type we see here. But we do have pretty much every single type of telescope. We have Maxitop, Newtonians, classical Cassegrains, Delta Rho, CDK, Ritchie-Creation, but above all, the refractors are the most consistent. They're the most simple. A lot of them require tip tilt, but they're all like very mechanically stable, especially things like the Redcat WIFDs. Here you see we have a couple of the new ones that just came out on site. They've all been pretty great. And you honestly can't go wrong with most types of refractors you get. Even the more budget ones like the ASCAR or Sharpstar or the ZWO scopes, they all seem to do quite well, even in a remote context. It's very hard to go wrong with a refractor. So apart from refractors, the scopes that prove to give us the greatest amount of challenge, which should not be a surprise to you, are Ritchie-Creations and Newtonians. We see a lot with some of the mass-produced Ritchie-Creations that they don't hold collimation very well, especially throughout the night. And if someone's using kind of a heavier camera or a longer focuser, or if they're using the stock focuser, rather, these can all kind of give some flexure issues that add to some difficulty. This is a commonly known thing in astrophotography, so it's no surprise that we see it here in the observatory. But every time I open up a box and I see an RC, I know I'm in for a good, 5 to 10 hours of collimation work every time. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. If you're using an RC or a Newt, it's good to potentially upgrade the focuser. Make sure you kind of have a camera setup that's not putting a gigantic load onto the draw tube to kind of introduce the flexure. That's definitely something to look out for. And yeah, upgraded focusers are always great. The Moonlights in particular are very good. We see a lot of Optec focusers as well. They are expensive, but they are very good for that reason. Of the Newtonians that we've used and the RCs that we've used on site, they do honestly hold collimation quite well. When you look at these types of scopes in a remote context, they tend to hold their collimation better than for a backyard user where you're taking it in and out or maybe transporting it in a car. Even some of the less expensive like Skywatcher Newtonians that are known for having mechanical issues, they do hold their collimation fairly well over time when they're in, a permanent fixed location. The RCs definitely always take a lot of work, but the bigger ones seem to be a little bit better for holding their collimation. So here's a bunch of the Newtonians that we have on site, and there's a big variety. You can see we've got like the, I believe that's a Sharpstar on the bottom right on an EQ35M. We have tons of Epsilons, 130s, 160s. We have a couple, I believe 3 ONTC Newtonians on site that I'm pretty impressed by with their mirror cells, and the carbon fiber tubes are quite nice. And we also have a number of Skywatcher Quattro Newtonians as well. But yeah, they seem to be quite good performers once you get them dialed in. And here's a couple of the Ritchie-Creations that we have on site. We see a lot of like the Aperture Carbon Star or the TPO carbon fiber or Ritchie-Creations. And again, it's a bear to get them collimated, but once they're there, they tend to hold quite well. So those are the RCs and Newts. Smart telescopes. This is kind of an interesting point because there aren't many of these at remote observatories, and I think we're probably the first ones to really host them at scale. They actually do work fairly well in tandem with either like a Mac Mini to run a system off of the actual AS, or what do you call it, the C-Star app. So if you remote in with Chrome Remote or AnyDesk into a Mac Mini, then you can run a C-Star or a smart telescope as if you're right there with it in person. Some people here also use PCs with BlueStacks, Android tablets, and a couple people also use Raspberry Pis. But here you can see we don't actually mount them on piers. We have them up close to the north wall roof line. We call this the C-Star bar, where we kind of are able to fit them in a way that's very dense, but also be able to make efficient use of the space along the north wall of the building. The north wall is kind of the main obstruction, limiting like how far we can put scopes because of the ability to polar line once you get so close to the north wall. So this kind of gives us a way to actually use that space. Some of the other types of telescopes we have on site, we have a ton of SCTs. Largely, these are all good CDKs like plane waves, AG opticals. We also have a lot of those on site, and those are very premium telescopes. It's no surprise. Those all do very well for remote imaging. So if you're thinking kind of about what telescope setup to use or what to send when you're doing remote imaging, it really is dependent on what types of targets you want to shoot. If you want to do galaxies, or depending on what your goal is, like nebula, galaxies, even planetary, it's going to influence what your decision is. There's really no wrong decision in that regard, because each telescope is a tool for a job. And in any case, for astrophotography, the best tool for any of those jobs is typically going to be the fastest telescope for that given focal length, which is kind of just a placeholder for the one with the most aperture. And in any case, the more aperture or the higher the F number you have, the more efficient you're going to be with your time. And even in remote imaging, what happens is it's kind of a treadmill where you'll have all of this time and you'll realize, oh, I can do bright objects super quickly. But then you'll learn about all of the faint objects. And then you go right back to needing fast optics, lots of time, because there's kind of this new subset of objects that you get access to via remote. And the faster your system, the better chance you have to actually capture these in a reasonable amount of time. So yeah, in any doubt, your best, fastest telescope is the choice that I would make. All right, so for mounts, this is kind of the biggest point on gear for remote imaging. We've seen a ton of different mounts, and kind of broadly in my mind, there's three main questions to think about when you're thinking about mounts for remote imaging. Whether or not you're going to go premium or not, whether or not your mount needs a homing capability or not, and whether or not you're going to use something like a German equatorial mount or a harmonic mount. So I'll start off with the question of premium mounts versus non-premium mounts. And in today's day and age, I don't think that premium mounts are specifically necessary for remote imaging. I don't think they're even necessary for most people's setups, especially if you have one that's wide field, like a small refractor going up to a 12-inch or a 10-inch SET or so. There's almost no reason to expend so much on a premium mount when you don't have to, because you may not even use the tracking capability of a premium mount for such a small telescope. But there are certainly some cases where premium does make sense to go with if you're actually going to use the specs that these mounts give. Like if you have a giant plane wave or you need to do unguided, then there's certainly some good use cases for premium mounts. But at our remote observatory, we do not have very many premium mounts, especially compared to kind of the more amateur mounts. By far, the most popular one we see here is the ZWO AM5. And we have not had a single AM5 give us any issues so far, which is really saying something. There's well over 100 of them here, and nothing has broken yet. Occasionally, we do notice some of the polar alignment bolts are a little bit loose, but it's a trivial matter of like, oh, someone's been using their own mount for years and they haven't noticed a couple of these bolts are loose. So we just give everything a good tightening as is needed. Interestingly, we also do have a bunch of Skywatcher Star Adventure GTIs on site, which are really cool. This is a mount that's really designed for portable users, and it has operated very consistently for us. We don't very frequently see issues with a Skywatcher, the Star Adventurer GTI, and we see probably more issues with software bisque mounts than we do with Star Adventurers, which is kind of the opposite of what you would expect. Yeah, even premium mounts do have especially their own issues, whether it be like USB connectivity with the software bisque mounts, or even when looking at AP mounts or 10 micron mounts, a lot of the times under temperature swings, the clutches on those mounts actually loosen themselves. And so someone's mount might not be able to slew over time. So even though a mount might be premium, every mount has its quirks. And I wouldn't really look at premium necessarily as a lens in making a decision, because the amateur equipment that's available today is honestly very good. And depending on your use case, it's most likely more than good enough for remote imaging. Okay, so kind of the more important question in my mind, premium versus non-premium, is whether or not your mount is capable of homing or not. For those of you who are unfamiliar, homing is basically your mount's ability to return to a physically known position after a disconnect event, either like a USB disconnect or a power disconnect. Your mount may power cycle and it won't remember where it was before the power cycling happened. And this can be a catastrophic thing if you aren't diligent with your mount in remote use. If you can't see it, you don't know where it is, and you can't home it, and you go off slewing randomly, you may just slew your stuff into your pier. It's not the end of the world, but it's not ideal. So I would say that they're not strictly necessary that your mount has a homing capability. We do have a lot of EQ6Rs on site, a lot of EQ8s. The GTI can't home, but all of these mounts can be used diligently for remote imaging if you have a camera to kind of verify the position of that mount every single night before you actually start it, so that you know where it is and you're not going to give yourself a pier impact. So the way we do that is we usually just attach with a camera mount, a little ZWO all sky camera that looks up at the scope so that you can verify the actual position of where your thing is located in real time. And this gives you an easy way to verify or return your mount back to a known position. Just slewing it up to North Park and then syncing to Polaris or power cycling the mount will let you take it back to that known home position pretty much every time. If you are looking for a German equatorial mount that has the homing function, basically all of the iOptron SEMs and GEMs have the ability to home. I'm a particular fan of the SEM 70, and it's pretty much like a good analog to the EQ6 that has a homing function. But if you already have an EQ6 or another mount that can't really find home on its own, it's definitely still workable for remote, as long as you can keep eyes on your stuff and you're diligent about checking it or making sure you didn't have any hardware failures the night before. And here you can see this is a pier cam photo from one of our customers, Shannon Foy. They have an astrophysics mount in a big old refractor, but it's a super cool view of the winter Milky Way. So lastly, when you're thinking about mounts, there is a big decision to make whether or not you want to go with a harmonic mount versus a German equatorial mount. Traditionally, I think the harmonic mounts are kind of designed around being portable for travel use and not so much for remote observing, but they have turned out to also be a really great mount for remote. But I think when you're using a bigger telescope that has a lot of drag in the wind, what we do see is that people get worse guiding numbers on particularly windy nights with a smaller mount like a harmonic in the case of these larger telescopes. So something with more inertia with a counterweight is going to be a bit more resistant to wind load. And wind is something you may see more frequently at a remote observatory because your scope is going to be out there, you know, every single night, whether it's a perfect night or a less than perfect night. So there's some evenings where if you have a larger scope, it might actually make sense to go with something beefier and heavier, especially because you don't have to set it up repeatedly. it's just going to be in place and maybe give you a little bit more stability. So something to think about when you're getting a mount. So for cameras in remote observing, basically all of them are pretty good and high quality. CMOS cameras are really nice in these days. The camera we see the most out here is ZWO, which shouldn't be a surprise. There's 250 plus ZWO cool deep sky cameras out here. Player One is also quite common, QHY as well. Of the cameras that we do have that have issues, it's slightly more frequent to see QHY cameras have some problems, but it's only happened probably 2 or 3 times. In any event, if you're going to be deciding what type of camera to use for remote observing, I always stray towards monochrome by far. The only time I think it actually makes sense to go one-shot color is if you're going to be comet hunting and you need to have an easier way to edit your data, or if you're doing like large time-sensitive mosaics in broadband, then being able to do one-shot color will give you a cleaner image in the end for gradients. But the vast majority of people, monochrome is certainly the way to go. And mostly for me, it's because it allows you to stay efficient when you're imaging, even when the moon is out. When you're at a remote observatory, the roof may be open a lot on the full moon or bright moon phases when you may not have imaged in your backyard. And so you definitely want to make the most of all of that time. And monochrome and being able to shoot hydrogen alpha or sulfur 2 gives you the way to be the most efficient with that stuff. So everyone absolutely needs to have an electronic focuser. As much as I would like to, I can't stand next to people's telescopes and turn the knobs all night long. And so the most common ones we see here that work well are the ZWO EAFs. They're my absolute favorite to install. They're just really, really easy to put on most scopes. And we've only had like 1 break ever. So they're a very, very stable way. They're ubiquitous. It kind of works across most telescopes. And if it doesn't work on some scopes like Takahashi's or Rasa's or SET's, then you just have to order a separate bracket and it works well. So if you're looking for one for your setup, I would go that direction for sure. Otherwise, if people are looking for premium focusers, the ones we really like, the Night Crawler is a very, very stable one. A lot of people here have the Night Crawlers, especially on like the FSQ 106, and they're quite stable. And the Optec Leo and Gemini, we have a lot of those on site. And even the new Hercules, the blue one that does both the focusing and rotating, all of those have been very stable, especially with bigger, heavier cameras like the Moravian CMOS cameras. So guiders and filter wheels, they're kind of a smaller accessory thing to think about. Whatever you have, if it works, it works. You just kind of have to keep in mind the same lessons you would have from the backyard. They still apply in remote contexts. You really just have to watch out for differential flexure. I would stay away from going too big on your guide scope and just be careful with that. I tend to like OAGs more just because they don't require refocusing since they follow along with your main camera. They can last a little bit longer in their usefulness in that way and give you a bit more accuracy, but whatever works at home works well in a remote context, as long as you don't have to touch it repeatedly. So most people here on site choose to have some kind of power accessory going beyond just the CASA or the digital logger for cycling the wall outlets. I think probably 70% of the people here have a Pegasus power box on their scopes. And if not the Pegasus power box, then either the Wanderer power box or they're using a Prima Luce Eagle where it gives you that capability in one package. But these are very nice to have. They make cable management a lot neater. And since we do all the installations here, it's me doing all your cable management. So I highly suggest and prefer the use of devices like this, just because it's going to make it easy, one, for you to be able to power cycle stuff You won't have to worry so much about cable runs, and it's just going to be a good thing in general. The one interesting quirk I see frequently that some people try to do is they'll use their power box to power their PC. And this is probably my number one pet peeve, because a lot of the times the power box has their ports set to stay off by default. And so there's no way to actually go in and turn on a computer without jacking into the Pegasus and setting its ports to be on. So if you are going to use a power box, I definitely suggest not putting everything on the power box. It's good for redundancy purposes to move something like your PC off to where you're not going to, cut your own arm off while you're trying to troubleshoot. Definitely something important to think about. But in general, with gear, I would say if it works in your backyard consistently and automated, it's most likely going to work for remote. I wouldn't say you super need a premium mount unless you're actually going to use the capability that one of those mounts would give. If something works consistently, then it's going to work no matter where it is on the globe. One thing I see a lot in remote is people think about setting up piggyback instruments or side-by-sides or even triple telescope systems. And in most cases, I think these types of complex telescope setups are more of a time trap than they are an efficiency boost. In almost every case, it's better to just get a telescope that's bigger with more aperture and a higher focal speed than to put two smaller ones together. And as I was saying, speed is always your friend with remote imaging, or even local imaging for that matter. The faster you can do it, the more you'll save time, the fainter things you'll see, and the better images you'll be able to make. So some interesting things we've learned setting up all of these telescopes and mounts, and probably doing over 500 polar alignments. We've tried basically every method out there that there is for polar alignment and really done a ton of research. What we've learned is that the QHY PoleMaster can be pretty good for a wide field system, but it doesn't really give you a number for your polar alignment error. And so it's not really the best, especially when you're looking through a longer focal length system. It's difficult to, dial in and make sure you're accurate. A lot of people polar align through their guide scopes or something with a larger field of view. I know I used to do this a lot when I was imaging with the travel rig. I would use something like Nina 3-point polar alignment or Sharp Cap and do it through the guide scope instead of my main scope. And we've learned that that's really not great for accuracy. One of the first methods I would use to actually do people's polar alignments is I had a little 30mm guide scope with a dovetail clamp, and I would clamp this onto people's telescopes and then do the polar alignment routines. And it really just didn't produce numbers that matched what people saw through their main OTAs. So that's what we've learned, is that it's best to do a polar alignment through the actual OTA, even if it's a higher focal length one. It's going to give a number that is a better result for when someone goes to measure it themselves. And we've tried basically every method that there is for this: the PhD, the Nina 3-point polar alignment, Sharp Cap, and the ASI Air. And the interesting thing is, for really small polar alignment errors, like if you're going below 5 arc minutes, is they all give you different numbers each time. And it even goes down to being so specific as where you choose to rotate the mount in this process. Whether or not you go from North Park east to west, or you start east or west and go up to north. Each time you do this, it's going to give you a different number, especially when you're going for super accurate polar alignments. And so that's something you need to keep in mind. But what we've done for the most part is use Sharp Cap for polar alignment. And we really enjoy it because it gives us the routine, the spinning routine that is fast, but also it's really flexible when going through multiple telescopes. Since we're doing anywhere from 2 to 10 polar alignments per evening, this lets us just jack into someone's camera with a USB, and then we can simply do the polar alignment without having to set up drivers and all these other things. So it's just a simple, accurate method that's fast, more importantly. So controlling and using remote telescopes, there's so many different ways to actually go about doing this. I do have my personal favorite, which is using Chrome Remote Desktop to actually do the remote connection, and then using Nina to actually control the scope. I've been using Chrome Remote Desktop now for well over a decade, and I've been running probably like 7 telescope setups using this, and it's rarely ever given me issues. The beautiful thing about Chrome Remote in particular is that if it's preloaded onto a PC and then you ship it out somewhere, as soon as that thing is connected to internet, you're going to have access to it immediately. And so it's a super seamless way, if you're sending a scope somewhere, to just be able to get into your system with minimal effort from anyone. And it's super stable. And yeah, it's just been the best for us. Nina is probably the best control program that exists. And these days, a lot of the reason is because of the active developer base. There's so many plugins and things that are happening with Nina, where it's rapidly evolving and you're getting new features all the time. And it also gives you a bunch of extra flexibility for automation that I've recently learned about that's been really, really cool. If you're traveling and you want to automate your telescope in a truly unattended way. So when people are running their scopes here in Nina, what a lot of people will do is actually connect to the thing called the roof status file. So at our observatory, you can connect to a shared network file or a shared network folder that lets you map to a file that it says whether or not our roof is open or closed at any given moment. And so you can set up your advanced sequencer in Nina in a way to where you can leave your sequence going and it will know whether or not the roof is open or closed, and it will start itself, stop itself, and do everything as needed instead of taking a bunch of photos of the floor or the roof. And I even have mine set up to where you can use batch scripts and event schedulers, so where you automatically turn your PC on and off, and then it will automatically launch the Nina sequence each day. So you can really do a lot of unattended imaging with Nina and remote. And the best part about it is that it's free. There's other programs that give you this capability, but they're not cheap. And Nina kind of packages it into a nice bundle where you don't have to pay for it, but it still gives you all the wonderful flexibility with automation. We also have a ton of people in our Discord that share Nina sequences or Nina tips for learning the advanced sequencer, which I certainly had to lean on because I actually came from SGP. I only recently switched over to Nina, and it was a bit of an interesting process learning how to use it, but I think it is kind of the future for automating telescopes. So if you have a remote telescope, there are some different things to think about in regards to what targets to shoot and how to capture them. If you've shot at all from dark skies before, then you're already familiar with the fact the sky brightness is much lower when you're in a dark place. And this means you're going to be able to expose for a lot longer than you're typically used to, especially when it comes to the narrowband wavelengths. I shoot primarily out here with the RASA at f2, and my sub exposures range anywhere from being like 2 minutes to 5 minutes, and sometimes up to 10 minutes long, even at f2. And you really do sometimes need these long exposures for ultra faint objects. And it is a good thing to have to expose for so long because it means you're getting, a cleaner signal and you're not flooding your sensor with a bunch of light pollution. But yeah, it's almost like going back to the CCD era for exposure times in some ways, which is interesting. For scopes that are maybe like f5 or f6, I've shot exposures going up to like 20 to 30 minutes long, and they work best for a lot of faint things. So when you're planning targets to shoot and capture, I have a couple of tools that I kind of view as essentials. What I think is the cool thing about remote is that it gives you the time to waste time on weird things that maybe there aren't so many pictures of. And you can kind of afford to be more creative exploring the night sky because you're not camping and feeling the pressure of dedicating your camping time to finishing an image. So some of the tools I use to actually go forward with that planning are Aladdin and CDS. So Aladdin, for those of you unfamiliar with it, is kind of like an astronomy research tool that gives you access to basically all the different surveys available in a bunch of different wavelengths. Like the DSS2 is the most common one a lot of people are familiar with, but you can get like the Finkbeiner survey, the Shasa survey for H alpha, the Galax survey for UV, ASCAP for radio, and you have all these different tools to actually research and look for weird things in the night sky that may be interesting. And when you pair this with a coordinate searching tool like CDS, you can actually do some research about what these things are. And this is kind of how I go through with a fair amount of target planning. If I'm looking for something unique or something that's not on the main catalogs, it just gives you an interesting way to kind of surf the night sky and look for something interesting to do. And when you're remote, you have the time to spend on these things that you don't know for sure will pan out into a good image, but are fun to explore along the way regardless. So being remote, it kind of means that you may be shooting a lot of nights with a bright moon out, as I said earlier. And there are some helpful things you can do to kind of work around this because, again, you may be running your scope a lot on these clear nights when the moon is out. I usually avoid doing any LRGB or O3 when the moon is above 50%. And when it is out, I try to stay pretty far away from it, like at least 30 degrees or so. You definitely want to stay far away or else it's just going to be like shooting in light pollution. A lot of the times I'll have a project that's going on the ecliptic, which is in the moon's path. And so in the event of this, I'll typically have a side project going at the same time, where once the moon kind of crosses into my object's field of view, you can switch over to another project, most likely in narrowband outside of the ecliptic. And you can stay more efficient this way, tackling two projects at once. And one helpful thing is I would say, even on these nights where the moon is bright, you do have a lot of hours before the moon rises and after the moon sets where they slowly build up over time. And it's definitely worth shooting in LRGB or O3 during these little hours because when you're remote, they definitely add up over time. And so I would definitely make use of all of that time that you get. So a tough thing to know is how much time to actually spend on capturing an object. And there's kind of two things working for you and against you in this context. There's the diminishing return law, where the more time you spend, the less gain you get in signal to noise. But there's also the integration time required working for you, where you have less time required from a dark sky site. In general, this is really, it just comes down to aesthetic preference. But in almost every case, I find you end up on a treadmill where you'll go for something bright and you say, oh, we're in a dark sky, we don't need so much time. But then when you actually go to photograph the thing, you'll say, oh, there's a cool dust mote or something interesting in the background. And all of a sudden you'll want more exposure time and it'll just build up and build up and build up to where you're trying to go after fainter and fainter things. And so it really just comes down to your personal preference and what you're trying to go for. But for me personally, it ranges anywhere between like 1 to 2 months for any given image. And a lot of people that go remote, I think, find this as well. You may get overwhelmed with data. And so it's a lot simpler to plan around just shooting one thing for 1 or 2 months. And it's kind of easier to schedule that out in your head than trying to shoot a bunch of different objects all at once. And in the end, you'll get a better image for the patients anyways. So every single observing location on Earth is going to have a wet season and a dry season. And when your telescope is fixed in location to one spot on the Earth, it's a really important thing to be familiar with. Even the driest places on Earth, like the Atacama Desert or the Kalahari Desert, they all have a ton of rain. Especially right now, Namibia has record rainfall. I have a telescope there that I haven't used in 2.5 months. So even these super dry locations, they have times where you're going to be doing less imaging, and they have times you're going to be doing a lot more imaging. Also, Chile has been particularly wet the last couple of winters. And so it's definitely a thing to keep in mind. And especially in terms of how big of projects you plan for remote imaging, as well as how you distribute exposure time across filters. During the wet season in any place, it's really smart to not bias time to one filter, but instead spread that out per night. So you're capturing all your RGB and O3 in small chunks in a single night. And this means that you're more guaranteed a finished image for all of your efforts instead of, oh, there's a giant storm front coming in. You may not actually have time to finish your project if you only did one of the filters. But in the dry season, it isn't so much of an issue. You're going to have like a high odds of clear nights, and you can basically do whatever you want in terms of specializing for one filter and one exposure. So one big thing is a lot of people go through a telescope loss. If they want to do astronomy at home still, they send their telescope remote. What do you actually do in astrophotography? And for me, what I've done is I've kind of focused more on astrophotography that's efficient to do in person or fun to do in person. Things like building a small travel rig. Here's one such example of that, a little AM3 with a Rokinon 135. Just a fun thing to take out camping that's not going to be a huge pain. Can be a lot of fun to still engage in astrophotography that way. Visual astronomy is a lot of fun to do. I've been getting back into that recently. And also landscape astrophotography is something that cannot be done remote. And so that is kind of the ways I've engaged with astrophotography, despite also doing a lot remote. There's no reason why you can't have your cake and eat it too when it comes to astrophotography. I like doing it in basically every single way. So yeah, that is the conclusion of the talk.
Well, that was a lot to absorb, Bray. You can stop sharing now if you want. You had a nice turnout. You got 166 people online right now, don't we?
Yeah.
With all that chatter there, I didn't see any questions. Molly, did you? A lot
No.
of discussion, though.
There was something about a cowboy hat earlier.
A cowboy hat.
Oh man, it's so far back now.
I think there was more
Bray-
than I think
It
there
might
was
have
more
been-
than one inside joke in there.
Yeah.
Bray, do you want to say anything about putting a rig out on Starfront?
Yeah. So kind of the process for bringing something out here is the first thing to do is if you have any questions or anything, we have an email that we very actively respond to. Most people that are thinking about sending a system here will ask us questions before doing so. So feel free, make sure you have everything you need with us first, and then you would make a deposit, and this reserves a spot at the observatory, and then you either prepare to ship or schedule a drop off of a telescope. And then you ship your stuff out or drop it off, and then we quote normally like a 3-week lead time for installs, although it's typically much faster than this. Yeah, and then we work to get your install done, and we are in touch as soon as it's polar aligned, and then we hand it off to you to actually use the system.
And these are your peers, and so they would just supply everything else, including an extension if they need it.
Yeah, so we provide the peer and the peer plate, one AC port, and then one Ethernet cable going into the system. So the only thing that people need to send is like the mount, the scope, computer, their power accessories, a dumb Ethernet switch if they need it, and then any kind of bolts that it takes to actually physically attach their mount to a peer. But that differs on the type of mount. Like the AM5 takes 3 M6 bolts. They usually come with your tripod. We usually always use those, but yeah, not much is required with the mounting.
So you have a lot of scopes out there. What kind of connectivity do you have?
So we have symmetrical 1 gigabit up and down. And it was actually here on property before we bought the land. It was one of the reasons why we chose to get it. I don't know why they have fiber internet in the middle of rural Texas, but it's great for us. So yeah, it's very, very fast internet. It's actually the fastest internet I've ever had because I've never had fiber before until this, even in the city.
So if you have 300, 400, 500 clients all using it, does it tax your system?
Yes. So we have extendable lines, so we can continue to get more with the local company that provides the lines, but we still get pretty fast speeds even with everyone sharing them. And the actual load, I mean, usually no one is all in on Chrome remote at the same time. And even so, doing a remote connection like that doesn't take up too much bandwidth. Doing big data downlinks would consume a lot of bandwidth if everyone did it at the same time. But usually people have their files being written to like a Dropbox or Google Drive in real time. And so it's kind of a trickle of subframes from everyone's system per night. And it's been more than enough so far, but we have the room to expand it as needed.
Eric, we have had a couple of questions come in. Anak Chan wants to know, how does that Vixen VSD in the background there perform? Any bloat in the blue range?
I do not know yet. It's been a paperweight so far until I buy the camera and mount for it. But I
It's
actually
in
just
preparation.
yes,
In
yeah,
preparation.
it's a work in progress.
Rod Potter wants to know if there are some Starfront users that are really a group where they're sharing rigs with a small group, contribute to the rig and share the cost.
Yes, we have a couple of those at the observatory. Yeah, basically you can share, do whatever you like with the actual space when you get it. But yeah, we have a lot of groups. I think off the top of my head, we maybe have 3 or so groups of people like that.
Okay. I have I want to share my screen for just a minute and go to the entire screen. Well, I haven't shared my screen in a while, have I? Share.
Yep. We're getting quite a few questions here at the end as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, why don't we,
Well, I can't seem to share my screen for some reason, but
if you have more questions, let's.
yeah,
let's
but
move
on
on.
April 13th is, for those of you who are down at Starfront, Paul Smaglik says, I feel like an idiot doing a remote telescope. And I've read the description of what Paul's written and what he plans to talk about, but he is going to talk about what he learned as he was setting up his observatory down at Starfront. So a lot of you guys would like to return here and just contribute as you did tonight, just shouting out various things as you go along there. Okay, I'm going to cancel there. Okay, I'm out.
Molly, did you see more questions?
What are the questions? Oh, I wanted to know, do you have any solar installations? Is it all nighttime?
It's all nighttime for now, but I was actually looking at solar telescopes today and thinking about how we could do that. It is something to consider. The issue is like the labor spent. Like we have a good schedule going, and introducing a bunch of astronomy work in the daytime while we're trying to install telescopes could be interesting. So it would also require a whole building to be made as well. And I don't think the scale for solar is big enough to where 30 people would send a setup. So it would look probably more something like what you have at SRO, Eric, where it's a private style building, which we haven't had any yet. But
to have a whole building with multiple scopes all developed or devoted to solar would be very difficult. And if you have a mix, then you're having the building open during the day when it's usually closed. And so you have people that are imaging at night with their roof open, they could get a little antsy about that. And I wouldn't blame them, actually. I think you need a small, if you're going to do smaller, you need something to hold maybe 10, 15 scopes. But it's interesting to do solar when you have such good skies, because most people don't.
Yeah, it's something we've thought about, and we're open to the idea, but for now we've been focused just on the nighttime.
Okay. Josh Carter wants to know if Bray can mention the cowboy hat lore. I think we just touched on it, but didn't get very deep. And I guess the answer is no. Okay. Any thought about C-stars and EQ mode?
We are patiently awaiting for ZWO to come out with their polar alignment routine, because it's very difficult to polar align them with existing methods. But yeah, I'm excited for the EQ mode. I think it will make those telescopes a lot more usable, because they really can't track through zenith at all. And we are hoping to really like expand and lean on smart telescopes as well, because we really just want to make all of it more accessible, you know, especially a lot of people can't afford a gigantic astrophotography setup, and the C-star is like the best way into it. But someone, again, may not be located in the right spot for it. So anything that makes smart telescopes better, we're excited about.
It's really, you probably don't want to cover rates, and that would all be online, and depending on the kind of rig that you have.
And they've got examples on the website for, like, you can go look at the telescope and see what category that would fall into. And that's helpful to kind of gauge what you'd be paying.
Well, it sounds like you're really giving people an opportunity that couldn't afford the rates of some of the bigger remote observatories. And maybe it doesn't appeal to me, but it will appeal to a lot of other people that could afford it. They want to have a couple hundred nights a year to do their imaging, rather than 10 while they're camping, and hopefully 5 of those are good. We've all been through that.
Yeah, exactly. It just opens it up to a lot more of the amateurs. And, you know, even a lot of backyard astronomy is inaccessible because it requires you to have a backyard, which I've lived in apartments for like the last 3 years, and very difficult for me to do Astro at all, you know, not even having a place to set up. So that's just the hope, is making it easier to get into so people can do more astronomy.
Can people come out and look at the facility if they want to do their own installs?
They can drop off on site, but for liability reasons, we don't let people into the buildings to do the installs. And this relates mostly to our ruthlessness with the floor plan efficiency, where the telescopes are very closely packed together, and it's a trip hazard to go walking around. And we want to protect everyone's telescopes in there. You know, we don't want you bumping into someone's scope and upsetting them. And so it's easier for us to handle the installs that way. But we do give people tours of the buildings and the site when they come to drop off. So if you want to see the site, that can certainly be arranged.
I understand that. I went out and did the install for the remote observatory with 2 piers, just 2 piers. And there were 3 of us in there. I don't know how many times we whacked our heads just getting around. So how, you wear a helmet when you're out there? You must hit your head now and again.
I have not hit my head yet. I've stubbed my toe more than a couple times, but I find if you walk slowly and pick your feet up more than you're used to, you can typically be safe. But yeah, especially in the nighttime in the buildings, working in there can be a little bit of a like Mission Impossible, trying to weave your way between the scopes. So not ideal for someone installing themselves.
So especially when those scopes could be moving while you're trying to do an install.
Yeah. The thing that scares me the most is when we have L mounts.
Oh, they
because
make
we're-
no sound
God.
whatsoever.
yeah, silent with a gigantic telescope slewing around. You don't know that you're about to get whacked in the head, and it's going to
They're
be
so fast. Silent but deadly.
Yeah.
Not only that, but when I have the guys help me with that, I say, hey, I'm going to move the scope because
Yeah.
they are quick and heavy, and I haven't
Um,
knocked over anyone yet.
We've got some more
Ye-
questions in the chat to get
Yeah.
through as well. Our own Mike Sample wants to know, do you guys perform drift alignment when you do your polar alignments?
I have actually done drift alignments on some systems. It's not my favorite for
Don't
obvious
blame ya.
reasons. But at a special request, if someone says please, I can do it for sure.
Do you help people build models?
Yeah, we do offer some services around like remote support, building models or running telescopes, all of that stuff. We can help with as needed.
Eli wants to know if it's possible to use Mac Mini or StellarMate platforms using software like Ecos and KStars.
Yeah, we haven't seen any of those yet, but I imagine it would work just the same way as the ASIers do. If it's on that same platform, it's going to work the same way with a VPN and a VLAN, and you'll be able to just remote in on your phone or iPad or whatever else.
Jimmy Brooks asks, how much of an issue is dust?
Dust is a constant battle. The thing about remote observatories is that they're outside half of the day. Like no matter what, dust will continue to build. As far as it goes for the optics and things like this, you can go a long time without noticing the optical effects of dust. It's going to manifest as a loss of contrast if you have like a refractor or something that's sealed. If you have a scope that has open elements like an RC, where the sensor may be directly exposed to the elements, it's a much bigger issue. But you won't notice it for a long time. But we do clean quite a bit. We do offer cleaning people's telescopes when they ask. And usually when I'm working on a telescope, if I notice it's really dusty, I give it a courtesy dusting while I'm there with it. But in the buildings themselves, yeah, we have to sweep and vacuum pretty regularly to keep things free from the elements. But it's a challenge always because they're outside half the day.
You know, at least most of your systems are sealed systems, so.
Yeah, exactly. So you won't notice the dust buildup for a long time. Some of my other remote systems at other observatories haven't been cleaned for like a year or 2 years, and I don't notice. So you can go for a while, but I try to keep things clean as I walk past them.
Are we doing any more questions?
There's one about using Tsuchinshan-ATLAS, but since it's not released yet, you probably don't know how well it will work. Tsuchinshan-ATLAS is, we just had a talk on it recently. It's a way to be able to control Nina from like a browser-based, instead of like remoting into the computer with like Chrome Remote Desktop, you can use a different browser-based interface to control Nina, which I imagine would work just as well if you have a connection to that computer. But software's not out yet, so we don't know.
Yeah, I briefly watched that talk. I didn't make
Okay.
it all the way through it, but I imagine it would work as long as there's a connection to that computer.
There's one more question at the bottom here, but my cat just walked in front of the screen.
Jeff,
so-
did we get the one about from Jeff Kelly that says if I buy a scope setup, can I have them shipped to you straight for assembly, or does he have to build it and then ship it to you?
You can ship it to us for assembly. It doesn't make a difference for us on site because a lot of people, we suggest people mostly disassemble their things before shipping them out for the safety of the gear. So it makes no difference if it's in a new box or used one. We'll install it regardless.
Hey, do you have a place for you guys to sleep? You have a little house where you can get some rest?
Yeah, so we're actually in it right now. This is my RV. We all live in RVs out here on site. So yeah, it is truly boondocking out here. It's been an interesting experience, but they're actually pretty nice on the inside. Like,
Well, how far from a Walmart are you?
40 minutes there and 40 minutes back.
Pete from Scotland wants to know if you have international users and they ship stuff from overseas.
Yeah, we have a ton. We have at least one from Japan, some from Poland, the UK, all over the place in Europe. And each of them kind of have their own like import duties and quirks about shipping, I believe. In general, we suggest people use UPS because they deliver really easily directly to the site. But if you are from an international country, chances are if you ask someone in the Discord, you'll find another person in your country that sent a scope, and you can ask for experience on doing that kind of a shipment.
You got some questions here about mentioning Discord. Brent mentions it, and a few other people talk about Discord. How do you guys use Discord?
Yeah, so Discord it's evolved in our usage. I started it to basically provide a way for people to answer each other's questions because we were getting inundated with so many. I was like, I need community help to deal with the inflow of questions. And so people started helping each other with planning their setups. And then it also morphed into our ticketing system where people could submit tech support tickets. And we recently morphed off of that to like a more robust system, but it's still been like where we manage our community and where like all of our customers interact, like share images, do all that kind of stuff. And I think it has like 1,500 people in it or so. So it's very vibrant. And it's a good place to go to for help. I know I've had to go to people for help with Nina there. So it's been useful even to me.
Well, I think we're all set. Bray, thanks very much. Great presentation. You had more people on tonight than I have seen in a while. So I would bet that if you check back in a week or two, you'd find a few thousand people have viewed the presentation.
Yeah, all you Starfront folks who are tuning into tonight's broadcast, come on back to our future broadcasts, and we cover all kinds of astrophotography topics that you're probably interested in.
That's a good point.
And volunteer to give a few presentations. I mean,
and volunteer. We could always use more people giving presentations.
We need somebody nearly every Sunday. So
actually every Sunday. So by the way, Bray and Jim, you're welcome to stay on after the show and we can have some interesting discussion, but I think we're all set. So Molly, you running the show tonight? Who's running it?
Yep.
You're running the show.
Yeah.
So
Yep, I've got it.
Thanks again to everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you next week. Yes, we'll see you next week. Jim Thompson's going to talk about solar. So good night, everyone. We'll see you next week.
Thanks for coming.
Bye.
bye-bye.